Now we have a presentation being given by Kerrie and Ciara on the service provision for 2021. All of whom you know them very well, and so this will be also interesting too. Thank you. Kerrie.
Thank you. Hi everyone. It's so lovely to be here today, to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. Also to everyone on Zoom who is taking the time to participate. That's really great. I know so many via Zoom would have loved to be here as well. Ciara unfortunately couldn't be here in person, but we are sharing the presentation. I'm going to start and then Ciara's going to join via Zoom a little later on. So I'm going to start by discussing some of the main issues that arise most years, and then Ciara will go on to discuss some of those topics in a bit more detail, but also some additional projects that arose last year. So I'll just start with our first slide. So in 2021, we recorded 303 contacts. 225 of those are with our existing members who contacted us for support, or in cases where we may have contacted them when we knew there may have been an issue arising for them. 78 of those contacts were from new inquiries. Now that could be polio survivors themselves who aren't members. They may not have been aware of the group. We're still hearing from people who had no idea we were here and just hear in from different avenues about us. We also hear from family members, sometimes who have a concern and they're just wanting to maybe source a bit of information themselves first before, speaking to a loved one about it. And also the community kind of teams as well. So the likes of physiotherapists, occupational therapists, there are some out there who are aware of us and will contact us about supports for people they're seeing. And then sometimes some other agencies. Just to say, those numbers don't equate to the times we may speak to someone. In some cases, we may speak to a member in the year, like a once-off, but where people are experiencing maybe ongoing kind of difficulties, there may be multiple calls, over the course of weeks or months, just depending on the situation. But that's just a very general overview of kind of the numbers that we were kind of engaged with last year, and I'm going to go on to kind of discuss more a breakdown of what some of those calls and conversations might have been about. Yeah, so assessment of needs. So just through discussion with our members, which is really important, we identify areas of difficulty that they may require support with. So general areas we discuss are maybe symptoms people are experiencing at a certain time, mobility at home and when they're out and about, and also your ADLs, your activities of daily living. So how you're managing maybe at home with kind of washing and dressing, those kind of personal areas. So of those, I'm a little bit nervous, guys. I don't know why. There's so many familiar faces in the room. So through those discussions, some of the top things that came out were issues around equipment, where people were maybe needing aids and appliances to support them at home and when they're out and about. Therapies, so the likes of occupational therapy, physio, chiropody. We also deal with OTs a lot. That can be linked in with the ANA, where the OT works with members to identify suitable and safe equipment to help maintain independence and general well-being. In some cases, OTs are required for maybe housing reports, where people may be applying for transfers or different grants that are available through the council. Also last year we spoke to, looks quite low numbers, but 4 people about engaging with their local support groups, and also 6 people in terms of telephone support. What are high there again is well-being. Ciara's going to go into that kind of aspect of it in later slides, so I won't dwell on that too much. But the others, that's a variety of issues where members need support with maybe accommodation issues, letters of support, social welfare queries, just quite a wide variety of things. So I'll move on. Okay. So in terms of those discussions that we had around aids and appliances, there was roughly 78 calls about that, of things that we ended up supporting members with on funding. That is kind of the breakdown. So orthotics, it'd be still, orthotics, footwear and insoles, they're still quite a high request and need. Obviously, it's an ongoing need for people. Repairs, we do a lot of supporting people with kind of maintenance of things like mobility scooters and things like that. In terms of mobility aids, so 10 last year, scooters were by far the more popular choice. I think with the scooters, when maybe people are starting to experience maybe a slowdown with their mobility, it's what people start to kind of look at as a transition. A lot of the times people start to notice the problems when they're out and about. So to stop maybe engaging in things that they would have enjoyed. Days out with the family, we've members who maybe like to go for a walk but weren't maybe able to keep up with their loved ones. So they get a scooter, and it means they just still get to engage, do the things they enjoy, and that's the important side of this, that people are able to maintain their independence and engage with those things that they really enjoy on a day-to-day basis. Seating is primarily, last year, it was primarily risers and recliners. They're great in terms of postural support sometimes for people, but also kind of like relieving those aches and pains that, cause people so many issues. So to have that bit of relief at home is great. And then other aids they're usually smaller kind of transfer aids. And then obviously there was some repair work as well done on stair lifts. Move on to a breakdown in the therapies. So they're the numbers there in terms of grants provided to members. Just to highlight, the counselling one is quite low, and just for members that maybe not be aware that we do have financial support for counselling, and our involvement is purely the financial element. There doesn't need to be a discussion with us as to why people would want to avail of it, but obviously like our minds and our body are so intertwined, so if people do feel that would be a benefit for them to engage with a counsellor, please do reach out and get in touch with us. And then just moving on to the heating grant. So the focus at the moment is on the lower income categories. And last year, in the end, 242 members were supported with a grant of €125. It is a very large administration project, liaising with a variety of suppliers, and it takes quite a lot of time to kind of work through it. But that's the kind of the numbers involved last year. So I think I've flown through that in record time, probably quicker than I actually planned out. But that kind of brings me to the end of my slides. So what I'm going to do is just check in with Ciara and make sure she can hear us okay, and see if she's ready to take over. Yeah, we can hear you, Ciara.
Okay, thanks very much. Well done. And just to repeat what you said, I think both you and I are far more comfortable on the other end of the phone. So while we're trying to cover so much information here on how we try to help and address issues, if there's anything that we're covering too quickly, do give us a call afterwards in the office. If there's an issue that we touch on here, and we can clarify it and go through it with you in more detail. Just, I suppose, as an introduction to the slides I'm going to do here, where Kerrie has kind of looked at the volume of calls that highlight the practical help we're involved in, supplying aids and the therapies. My slides will take a look at the other calls we're receiving and the areas of work where we're trying to promote change, I'd say, and advocate for individuals so that their situation improves. The knock-on effect of taking those calls is because we're spending more time in these areas. Polio Survivors Ireland is getting invited to take part in collaborations and projects then, which we hope affect policy change. So looking at this first slide, I'm looking at where we've received the next highest numbers of calls outside of those requests for tangible aids and therapies. And as you can see, they're typically calls looking for information or support where a member needs to access, say, some financial aid in the form of a grant, but also where they might need help in the form of telephone counselling. And I suppose that would maybe reflect the low numbers going on into face-to-face counselling, is that Kerrie and I would manage a lot of basic telephone counselling over the phone. And the other areas that we find we're assisting in is people looking for some continuing to receive a consistent amount of calls in, and that's the information pack, which Kerrie touched on there. It's our new members and people who are new to the register, or even just new healthcare professionals looking to see what the organisation can do to help them. We would also receive calls for the person, the disabled driver, so someone who's looking to try and acquire a primary medical cert, or who may need their free travel pass, or a parking permit, or indeed adapting or buying an adapted vehicle. We can help with advice around that. And then the third item there on the left-hand side would be around social welfare, and just doing letters of support and advocating for people when they're trying to appeal for a medical card, or their disability allowance, or if they've experienced a change in circumstances where they have to apply for any of these things for the first time, we can help signpost that. Then over to the right-hand side of the screen, I've listed the 3 areas where we've actually witnessed an increase in calls. And in turn, that means the amount of hours that we work has increased handling them. So I've categorised those areas into well-being, housing, and equality. And then the rest of this presentation is just going to go on into a little bit more detail on each of those 3 areas. So if we move on to the next slide, there, please, Kerrie. And I think that brings up the first slide on well-being.
Yeah, that's it.
Excuse me. So not surprisingly, as you'd expect, from late 2019 to late 2021, we've dealt with a significant increase in the amount of calls relating to members' well-being. And ordinary well-being is an element of all our calls. Like, we would always check in on how our call is doing. But during the pandemic, it did actually become the real focus on the entirety of a lot of calls. So during that period, we started to record the content of calls, and just to see how it was impacting on our members' emotional and practical concerns. And looking firstly at the emotional concerns, it did appear that the length and the strictness of the lockdown would impact differently on members' emotional well-being. So, for example, say at the start, during that immediate strict social restriction, the full lockdown, the predominant issue that we started to record appeared to be feelings of low moods or feeling depressed. The focus of calls were around feelings of confusion, isolation was mentioned, and for some people there was a mention of a loss of purpose, that disruption to their daily routine and how they used to feel valuable. As the restrictions lifted then, and when there were some restrictions in place, but not total lockdown, we had calls describing anxiety. They appeared to become more prevalent. And that could have been due to the fact that people were nervous about the uncertainty of their situations. They were starting to be able to enter into the bigger environment again, but they were a bit uncertain about it. And there was concern, of course, and wonder about where is the virus circulating and how could you avoid that. So alongside those emotional concerns that we were recording were members' practical concerns, and that included their ability and the disruption they were experiencing to complete their activities of daily life, whether that be their grocery shopping, collecting their prescriptions, keeping appointments, taking exercise, taking part in college or work. There was huge disruption to carers entering homes or people visiting their healthcare professionals. Transport was suspended and disrupted. So we found we were having conversations on how to manage what was happening to people's practical daily life. And also included in that were people calling us about their family concerns. They hadn't been able to visit them. They were worried about health issues within their families and their own health issues. Many of our members were childminders for their grandchildren, and they were concerned about how they couldn't do that anymore. And of course, then that had the knock-on effect concerns about family members' employment and people losing jobs. So we noted that we were discussing areas like that and trying to problem solve with our members. And then a lot of our life moved online, like today. And so there was just some anxiety about how to move your life online, how to use those online services. So if we move to slide 3, and it'll just go over very briefly what we felt our role was and what we found our role evolving as to help our members. So the first one there was the public health messaging, just that distribution of information. So all efforts were being made to keep up to date with that public messaging, and more so to understand that messaging, which at times I think we all found a challenge. So it was a learning curve for us as well. And then once we understood it, we tried to share it with the members. And we tried to ensure that our members had access to information and a good sense of what was happening, and also how to navigate these new environments. And we did find that that was key to reassuring our members and just building that sense of security. Other things that we tried were to encourage our members to problem solve. And again, I found this a very shared experience, because what I learned from callers was that living with a disability has made a lot of our members very proficient with problem solving. So they actually helped me a lot during the calls. Then just moving on, assessing what you control and what you have to let go of. Just take care of your own environment, to take care of that during the pandemic, and try not to focus on the larger issues. And then reflecting actually just on what Professor Kenny has been talking about, we also found, and just looking at resources and what the HSE could advise us to report back to members, it was very much about keeping your routine during lockdown. You know, no matter how small, try to have some sort of routine that involved getting quality sleep, trying to retire and rise at a similar time, trying to stay active, moving, exercise during isolation. All of these things add up to a good routine, which has shown has positive impacts on your mental health. And then just finally, the last 2 pointers there, we encourage people to connect with others. Talk to people, make that phone call, and try and stay connected to your services and to your family during that time. And finally, the mindfulness. There was a lot of focus on how mindfulness could help during times of stress. So just moving on to where we are now, we're emerging from the pandemic, but it does still present areas of concern for our members, and more recent phone calls do continue to report some feelings of loneliness, but I think there's a lack of confidence there for some people, and some people are feeling out of sorts just as they return to that everyday life. So, you know, they're trying their best, but everyday behaviours have changed, you know, from the more intimate, like hugging, to handshaking, socialising, whether we wear or don't wear our masks. It's requiring us all to consider how we act, and sometimes it can make us uncomfortable. So we're just working through that. And I suppose the key at the moment, the advice that I'm giving on the phone at the moment, is just to repeat some of what we've learned from our earlier stages about letting go of what we can't control, and just letting members know that they're not alone, that they can use the office phone number. There's the Ring telephone service, or we can actually link you in with other helplines and other services, and we're just going to continue to do that. So moving off from wellbeing, the next area I'd like to look at is how we have been helping in the area of housing. And as highlighted in that earlier slide, we're being increasingly asked to help members with their inquiries with regard to housing, and that would be both the adaptation of existing homes, and then the acquiring of homes, either from a local authority or from new builds. And a lot of the work that we find we're doing is kind of signposting and advocating. So we might introduce a member to their local housing authority, we're liaising with housing officers, we're helping our members with the application processes, and we're also helping our members link in with occupational therapists and GPs to complete their reports. And in addition to that, Polio survivors have been invited to take part in a couple of projects, and they were aimed at launching and informing the new housing strategy for disabled people. So if we look at the first project we were asked to take part in, our members were asked to participate in a call to create short videos. And in the videos, they were to outline their hopes for the new strategy. And these were going to be used at the launch. And while we're all aware that there's a housing crisis out there, I think disabled people, not only are they on those waiting lists, but they also have added difficulty in that they may not be able to afford to adapt their home, or they're being inappropriately housed. So the project I was asked to do with a couple of our members was last January, and I think it was particularly poignant because of the time of year. It was straight after I came back from work from the Christmas holidays, and it just really highlighted that a number of our members were homeless during the festive season. One of the videos used and depicted was a member of ours living in Cork, and hotel room could barely contain his chair. So his mobilising at the moment is completely hampered. And that means even just daily use of his bathroom has to be very carefully managed, and he has no carer there available to help him. So quite often he has to mobilise out of his chair across the floor on his own and use his bathroom that way. And also, while he does have a balcony, he can't access it, so the most that he can manage is to just unlock and push that balcony door open ajar. But during the pandemic, he explained that he experienced really bad severe disruption now to completing his activities of daily life, whether that be getting his laundry done, getting some of his own groceries, engaging with his OT, or even getting his wheelchair repaired. And his message accompanying the video was very simple. He just described the confines of that hotel room as a prison for him now. And his hope this year is to leave hotel accommodation. A second video that was used was highlighted the difficulties for one of our members here in Dublin, and she has 2 young children, they're aged 12 and 3. They're currently on the homeless list here. And in the lead up to Christmas, a friend had allowed them to move in and use their living room. But unfortunately, as we well know, at Christmas numbers spiked, and this particular member and her children, one of the children, contracted COVID-19. So her friend, having children of her own, had to ask them to leave. And because the HSE emergency accommodation at the City West Hotel can't admit children, they actually had to sleep in an isolation room in Tala Hospital for 3 nights. Now, they are currently living in an emergency accommodation site in Dublin City, and that provides them with a bedroom and some shared kitchen facilities. But her message of hope was that her family would be housed this year so that her children don't have to enroll in any more schools. So as you can see, there's a lot of work to be done with our very vulnerable members there. Moving on to the next slide, the second of the projects that we took part in was the consultation with other disability organisations. And how did we take part in that? So all of the participating organisations conducted a study on the housing needs of their members. And the first thing we had to do was describe our role. So I suppose I tried to describe the role of Polio Survivors Ireland as having a focus on accommodation to enable those with a physical disability to live independently. So we tried to support our members to adapt their own accommodation or identify accessible accommodation to move into. And the survey was sent out to a number of our members, and the feedback I got for question 1 is as in what were the main barriers. And the barriers to accessing a home, they told me, was demand for accommodation is far greater than supply, and I think that's the most obvious one. Homeless members and members exiting direct provision don't meet criteria of having an existing network in an area. So local authorities are very slow to take ownership of their needs. And what that means is that we've created a very transient community of our homeless people and our people exiting direct provision. So they move around quite regularly, they'll have different addresses, they'll spend months, maybe a year here, then they'll move on somewhere else. And so what that does is it disrupts their ability to be added to a housing list. And because there's, as the next point states, there's no cooperation between housing authorities. If you move from one housing area to another, or if you're forced to move from one housing area to another, you lose your place on the list. You go right back to the beginning. Also, members reported being stuck in emergency accommodation. So once you're placed in a hotel room or even unsuitable accommodation, you're no longer a priority. The job is deemed done, and there's very little aftercare or come back to see how you're managing. And there's also an unusual presumption that people with disabilities do not require family homes. So I find those 3-bedroom homes, they're not necessarily, the people, the families living with a disability, they're not visited they're not notified when those houses are becoming available. And then the findings on the barriers to adapting an existing home. So if you're living in a home, whether it be your own or rented or a local the barriers to adapting that home. And the process of adapting existing accommodation is intimidating. Members reported that the experience of applying for a grant to adapt was lengthy, frustrating, expensive and off-putting. Applicants often have to discover and complete the forms themselves. They have to engage with relevant third parties, and that can be difficult for a person with a disability. Several members admitted to giving up when they were dealing with their local authority housing officer, and a number of members reported a negative experience when they interacted with those housing officers. And in some areas of the country, it was actually reported that the process of adapting the house was more successful and slightly based on a who-you-know system. So moving on from that, we have to try and take those findings and say what, in our view, needed to be prioritised within this strategy. And so the first thing we put down is the most obvious one, it's accommodation supply. And I know that's the most difficult one to address, but it is worth putting down that if we don't have the supply there's very little we can do. Then moving on from that, we ask that there be a clear pathway for our homeless community and those needing emergency accommodation. Then that there be a clear pathway for adaptation processes. Perhaps that there could be customer service training for housing officers, given the high number of negative experiences. And then that we might centralise the application system, so that the existing system whereby local housing authorities are not communicating with each other or adding people to waiting lists, given they're not taking into account the amount of time a person has been sitting on the housing list, and they're making them start from square one again. So to centralise that application system. And so those findings and recommendations have since been submitted, and we're being told they will be used to continue the journey to help people with a disability receive a fair allocation of housing. But I suppose the reality remains, and we can all see that ourselves in the news, that the demand for housing still far outnumbers the current supply. And from where I'm standing and the people that I'm touching base with, I can't report any significant improvement in my current casework. So we just have to wait and see what happens with the strategy. Moving on to my final slide, well, to the next slide, I just wanted to give you an idea of the work and training that we've been involved with, working with our members living in and trying to exit the Irish direct provision system. So just to say, we have had 42 registered members with experience of living in direct provision, and that's not to say that they still live within the system, but they have done at some time, and some of them do continue to live within the system. And what that has actually done is it's given us as an organisation a very valuable insight as to what it's like to live in direct provision for a person with a disability. So late in 2020, we were actually asked to submit some findings and provide some case studies on life in direct provision for our members. So after surveying them, their member feedback, again, unfortunately, we found that it was quite negative, and the most basic of provision being the accommodation, that came in as being of a very poor standard. The size of rooms allocated is very small, quite poor for someone with a disability. Members live in rooms with inadequate space to mobilise or transfer, so there are constant risks of falls, and they find that they are not able to mobilise up off the floor easily. So they spend a lot of their time accessing the bathroom or getting into their wheelchair by literally crawling across the floor and having to transfer that way. In particular, our members who are full-time wheelchair users, they find that they're not given adequate room to store their mobility aids. So quite often their wheelchair is left out in the corridor or in the storage space, and they can be subject to damage when they're left there. Bathrooms are not accessible. Members are not necessarily able to toilet or shower easily or safely. Facilities to study and work in the accommodation centres are not available. There's little or no consideration being given to families living in direct provision. So those families that we're working with, they are expected to share a bedroom with their children, and they have very little other living space for them, and we quite often discuss with parents that their children are using the hallways as a play area. And then with our individual members, they're expected to share rooms, and they have very little notice or consultation around who's going to share their room or how many different people will share their room. So you could find that you're sharing with a person, and then when that person is moved on to another centre, whether it be 3 months or 6 months later, then you'll have a new person. You could come home from college or come home from your training programme, and there'll be a new person in the room. And then outside, like beyond the building, the public pathways, because we provided some powered wheelchairs to our members in accommodation centres, what we found is the public pathways around some of the facilities are in very poor condition. So accessibility continues as an issue beyond their room and their building. Then just around them accessing therapeutic intervention, trying to link in with an occupational therapist while living in direct provision is particularly difficult. Our members would report not having much of an idea how to access it to begin with. They, like most of our members, they're subject to lengthy waiting times, and they're not prioritised. So that impacts how they complete their activities of daily life, but it also impacts how they get access to aids. And then by the time their appointment comes round, it's often cancelled because they've been moved on to another accommodation centre, and they're not there anymore. So the appointment date arrives and the person has been moved on. There's also a strange lack of uniformity when we're engaging with OTs, and some will visit accommodation centres, but others won't.
So, Ciara, I'm very sorry, but we'll have to wrap up now.
No problem.
Really sorry.
So just to say that, just to highlight that, on top of that, there are some other supports that they found difficult to access, and there's ongoing training and projects for us to take part in. And as I say, I know it's so much data to cover, and it's very difficult to do it. So if there's anything that you want clarified or any information you want me to go over with you, do bring into the office.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ciara and Kerrie.